Hi, I'm Amy French from During Quiet Time. I'm here today to introduce a free block to go with my book Petal and Stem. I'm running a sew-along right now for my Garden Whimsy quilt, and I was thinking that the grass blocks here and the pixie cut blocks down here are a little bit time consuming. They have lots of pieces, and while I really love the look, it might be challenging for a beginning paper piecer. So I'm introducing a new block today that can be used to replace either of those blocks in the quilt. This is the Seedling block, and you can see how it would look really cute scattered among the grass blocks, or even just replacing all of the grass blocks. And additionally, you can use it with a pot to look like a little plant that's just beginning. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is to download your PDF pattern pieces for the Seedling block. I will link to this down below. I like to just print right on copy paper. You can use specialty paper for paper piecing if you'd like. Then I cut the excess paper off just to make it easier to handle. You'll notice I'm not cutting right up to the seam allowance line. I just like to cut the sections apart. There we go. So this block is just made of two sections, section A and B, and we're going to paper piece them each individually, trim them down to their 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then piece them together. So let's start with section A. I want to point out that when you're paper piecing, this is the right side of the pattern, and you're going to be piecing on the wrong side of the pattern and creating a mirror image. That's why when you look at the block image that's in your pattern, and you look at your pattern pieces, you might say, uh-oh, something's wrong, because the bigger leaf is on my right, and here it's on the left. And that's correct, though, because when you paper piece, you get the mirror image, and it will look like this. If you can see through it all, I can see my bigger leaf, the B, is here, which is here on my pattern piece, so on my pattern diagram. So this is showing me what the finished block will look like, and these are the actual pattern pieces. Alright, so we're going to start by paper piecing section A. I wanted to mention a couple of the supplies I like to use when I'm doing that. One is this Daylight Company Wafer 1 light box, and the other are these clover pins. I like them because they have a flat head, and they're nice and long and sharp. Alright, so let me turn on this light box and we'll get started. So this is going to be the right side of our pattern piece when I'm referring to the right side, and this is the right side of our fabric. So we're going to take the wrong side of the pattern piece and the wrong side of the fabric and put them together. So I'm going to take the fabric that I cut for section A1 and place it on top and make sure that all of section A1 is covered, including the 1/4 inch seam allowance around it. So I'm not sure how well you can see, but I can see that right here is the edge of my seedling leaf, and everything is covered. One of the things that beginning paper piecers often think of is that they need to stitch this piece now that it's on, but we actually do not stitch the first piece, we just leave it there. And now we're ready to piece the second. So the second piece is section A2, and it's a little bit difficult to see the lines through here because of the dark fabric. So one thing I do to make that a little bit easier is I put the pin on the back side. So I'll go in the beginning of the line here and come back out at the top because it's a nice short line. I'm able to do that. And then I can visualize where that line is if I can't see it well due to the color of the fabric. Now I'm going to take a piece of my background fabric for section A2, and the reason I know it's the background fabric is I refer to my pattern block diagram, and I see that A1 was the green for the seedling and A2 is background fabric. So now I'm going to take some of my off-white background fabric, and I just have a little section to cover, so I'm just going to cut a small piece. And what I like to do when I paper piece is I like to try to keep the grain of the fabric even with the sides of the block, and I will fold the fabric to meet the angle of the line that I'm going to be stitching on. And then I'll adjust the fabric till it meets that line. And I can see through the light box that I'm covering all of the seam allowance, and I'm covering all of the area that will be A2. Now I just flip this piece open so that I can stitch. And I'm going to pull that piece, the pin out, and now I'm ready to stitch this line. So I flip my pattern over, and now I'm going to stitch on my machine using a stitch length of about 1.6. If you're new to this, I would do a 1.8, it's easier to seam rip. And I'm going to start about 1/4 of an inch beyond the line, back stitch, stitch down the A2 line, go beyond, and back stitch. So I've just stitched this line, I'm going to show you on both sides, a little bit beyond the A2 line, all the way down the line between A1 and A2, and into A3. Now I'm going to fold back my paper, and I'm going to cut this excess seam allowance. Now make sure that you're not cutting the piece that will be covering A2 or the piece that is covering A1. You don't want to accidentally cut these pieces off. Now it's very important that we press this out. Alright, so you can use a seam roller, a wooden seam roller if you like, or you can press with your iron. I use a dry iron. And it's important to take the time between each step to do this, because otherwise you'll have a little bump and then things won't line up properly with the next section, especially on the seam lines where things have to join. Alright, now I look at my block diagram again, and I can see that section A3, we're just going in number order here, is also background fabric. So I'm going to use a chunk of my off-white. So I need to cover this area. I see that the line is right here between sections A1 and 2 and the area that will be A3. So again, I'm going to fold my fabric to match up with that line. So I can tell that this is my stitching line here, that all of the area marked A3 will be covered by this background fabric. Now I'm going to flip it, and this is important because I see a lot of people in my classes forgetting to flip this fabric at this point. So you need to flip this fabric over so that your right sides are together like in all sewing, and now you'll be ready to stitch. We're going to stitch again along the A3 line, but I'm going to start out in the seam allowance here, and I'm going to back stitch, stitch all the way down, and go into section A4 a little bit and back stitch. Alright, so we've just stitched this piece on, and now I'm going to need to cut off this part, which is the excess. Now because this is stitched into the paper here, I'm just going to pull those threads through the paper, and now I can still fold my paper back and cut off this excess. So I just line my 1/4 inch line up here with the paper and cut. Now once again we're going to press this fabric open. You might notice I'm working on a wool mat. The wool mat really helps because it warms up with the iron as well, so then you have heat from below and heat from above, and it helps you to get a really nice crisp block. There we go. So we've accomplished covering sections A1, A2, and A3, and we're moving on to section A4, which will finish off the bottom part of the block. Now we're going to be covering section A4, and I can see that pretty well here using the light box. And this is, I can reuse my fabric that I had just used and cut off from section A3 and make use of this angle cut. So I'm going to fold that fabric so that I'm covering all of section A4, and this will be my excess here that I'm cutting off and can reuse for another section. So now I flip this open and stitch along the line just the same way we've been doing. Now I'm ready to do the final trimming of the excess in the seam allowance. Pull the stitches off, pull the paper back, and then cut that off at about the 1/4 inch line. Now, if you've learned to paper piece in a different way, this might seem a little bit foreign to you because I do paper piece a little bit differently. If you're more comfortable using an add-a-quarter ruler and paper piecing that way, go ahead. There's no one way to paper piece. Now I'm going to press this open. Alright, so I just went ahead and pieced section A5 and A6 because we're just repeating the same process that we already did. And I wanted to move the block along a little bit to section A7. So that will be our final section for this block. So again, I can see my line here, and I know that this is the section that needs to be covered. So I can take my fabric and fold it along that line. And this way I keep the grain of the fabric even with the edges of the block. Then I flip the fabric over, and now I'm ready to sew. When I have a larger piece like this, sometimes I think it's smart to put a pin in here and a pin in over here, because otherwise the fabric has this tendency to flop over like this when you're stitching, and you end up stitching it in with your nice tiny stitches, which you don't want to have to seam rip. So it's easier to keep them pinned, and this is why I like to use the clover pins, because they're flat. So I can take this now to my sewing machine and flip it over and stitch with those pins there. If I had a pin like this with a ball on the, here we go, with a ball on the top, it would get stuck in my machine. Now I'm going to trim off the excess again. So again, this is going to be the piece I'm keeping because this will finish covering my block. This is the excess that I'm cutting off, and I can use this to piece the other half. So I'm going to rip those stitches back and fold the paper back, making sure that everything's where it should be so I'm not cutting the wrong thing off. Not that I've ever done that before. There we go. Now we'll press this back and we'll have this part of our block, section A, pieced. So now I'm ready to trim this block down to the seam allowance. So when I do that, I try to consistently trim in the same way in every paper piece section. I line up this 1/4 inch line on my ruler with the finished block line here, so that when I cut, it will be cutting the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Alright, so here we go. We have our finished section A, and now maybe you can see better what I meant when I said that the pattern piece looks wrong here because this does not look like it's not in the right spot. But when it's pieced, now we match up with the diagram. So I pieced section B already so that I could show you how to sew them together. So when we sew them together, see how this is a rather large piece and kind of is pulling back? You can use a dab of glue, but I tend to not like to use glue, and instead I just pull the piece into its position and put one of these clover pins in to hold it, making sure that the pin isn't going to be where I'm stitching because you don't want to stitch through the pin. I do the same thing on both sides. Now I'm ready to join the block. So again, it's right sides together like any sewing project. And when you line them up, it's a little bit tricky because we have this sharp angle. There's a little angled line where the seam allowance, if you were stitching along the line here, and kept going, the angle starts where your needle would leave the fabric. So I like to make sure that when I'm lining this up, if I pretend I'm stitching here and put my fingernail down, that my needle will be exiting the fabric right here in that little corner. And then I pull my fabric, my block piece up, and then it's in the correct position. Now I will sometimes take a pin to put in to hold those together so it doesn't shift. And I know it looks really awkward the way I just pinned it, but if you notice that has not moved, I've found that when I pin much farther back over here, it tends not to shift the placement of my pattern, and then I can stitch it accurately. If I try to pin this way, like this, things start to move on me. So now I'm going to go to my machine and I'm going to stitch along this line here. Alright, so we just stitched our seam allowance and now the block is complete. So I will think about which side to press the block to make less bulk sometimes, or which way it looks better. You can consider that because sometimes it does change. In this case, I'm not sure it matters too much, and I think I'm going to press it this way. It just seems to fold better that way. There we go. So we have our finished seedling block, and down here you'll notice it doesn't seem to meet up well, and that's perfectly fine. It's not supposed to. If you notice on the finished block, when you take into consideration the 1/4 inch seam allowance, all of that's cut off. So see, back here, this is where it's going to join to the pot. So those aren't actually supposed to meet. That's not a problem. So it looks a little weird here. Just that's how it looks when it's finished. And you can sew it onto a pot if you'd like. And I think it looks really cute.